Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, taking his rightful role in the accounting department of the intelligence agency.
It's where you belong, I say.
Right? Just give me like a calculator, and that's probably about as much as I can aspire to.
And let's be honest, you're hidden away in an office there, and we both have faces for podcasting.
Scott, they won't even let me use sharpened pencils. Like, come on.
I'm not sure it's an accountant's office you actually work at, mate. Do you wear a white coat that's tied together in the middle?
No.
Okay. Now, I promised you all a very special interview. This one came to us last minute, but Cam and I both love 1993's David Cronenberg film M. Butterfly. We spoke about it a while ago, and I would urge listeners, if you haven't heard that review, I would click on the link in the show notes below and go back and listen to that review if you get a chance, either before this interview or afterwards, to hear our thoughts on M. Butterfly and talk about it as part of David Cronenberg's oeuvre or filmography or whatever you'd like to say. But we are talking to a very special person behind that film, Cam. Who are we talking to today?
Yes, we are talking to Tony Award winner David Henry Hwang, who masterminded the play M. Butterfly and then also wrote the screenplay for the David Cronenberg version. And so there's a lot of depth here and a lot to mine just in terms of the origins of the story and then the evolution into a film.
Absolutely. David was very generous with his time. He's taken us on a whistle-stop tour through the production of M. Butterfly from play to screenplay, as it were. So I think without further ado, Cam, let's get to it. Roll the interview. And joining us now on the show, he is a Tony Award-winning playwright, the screenwriter of 1993's spy film M. Butterfly, and his critically acclaimed play Yellowface is currently playing on Broadway at the Todd Hames Theatre. It is Mr. David Henry Hwang. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hey, I'm really well, thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. We tried to get this one together when we tackled M. Butterfly about a year ago now, and we're glad it's finally happening because it's a film Cam and I really love, so much so that we put it on the list of must-see spy films of all time, which is...
Thank you.
For us, that's high praise. I don't know if it means anything to anyone else, but...
I appreciate it, so thanks.
But let's sort of get into M. Butterfly slowly but surely. And I think the first question is sort of leading more towards the play than the film. And getting us to that point, I mean, your job mainly is as a playwright. And that's sort of, where you've won your awards for. We spoke about that now. Obviously, you've got a play going on at the moment. What brought you into wanting to be a playwright in the first place? How did that journey start for you?
I was a musician, so I played in pit orchestras and high school musicals.
Okay.
And I found that I always liked kind of hanging out afterwards when the orchestra had been dismissed to listen to the director give notes. So there was something that attracted me to theater, but I really didn't grow up in a theater family or anything like that. Then when I got to college, they gave us this form that said, what do you want to do that you haven't tried before? And I wrote playwriting and journalism. I went to Stanford, and Stanford at the time didn't have any playwriting classes. So I just started writing them in my spare time. And I found a professor who was willing to take a look at them. He told me they're really bad, which they were, and that my problem was I wanted to write plays, but I didn't actually know anything about the theater. But the same professor was a good guy. He helped me design a playwriting major within the creative writing English department. And I basically saw as many plays and read as many plays as I could for the next couple of years. My senior year, I wrote a play to be done in my dorm. And 14 months later, through a variety of fortuitous circumstances, it opened off Broadway at the Public Theater in New York. And then I started to have a career.
Wow. And you worked with Sam Shepard for a period.
Yes.
Is that correct, too?
So the summer between my junior and senior years, I saw an ad I'm from Los Angeles, in the LA Times that said, study playwriting with Sam Shepard. And I clipped this thing and sent it in. And it was the first year of what eventually became a pretty prominent event in Southern California theater, but this was only the first year that they ever tried to do it. So there were only two of us that applied, so we both got in. And I got to study with Sam and another fantastic playwright teacher, Maria Irene Fornez. And I feel like that's really where I learned to write plays and where I started writing that play that would become my dorm play, that would become my first off-Broadway play.
Hmm. Do you remember any of the key lessons you gained there that were like kind of what you overcame to get to that point?
I think it's a lot about learning to write more from your subconscious, learning to follow your gut, your impulse, your heart, instead of your conscious mind, which is more likely to tell you, well, you can't write about that. That's not really a play. Who do you think you are? Nobody's going to care about this. And to bypass that stuff, and what David Byrne and Talking Heads used to stop making sense. Like, don't necessarily try to make sense all the time. Write what you feel, and that's what I learned.
And we're skipping over huge sections of your history by jumping to this next question, but I want to dive into sort of the roots of M Butterfly, and of course it started as a play, and obviously won Tony Awards, and we'll get to that. But where did that first concept of M Butterfly come from? Where did that sort of blossom from?
Yeah, so I was at a cocktail party, and it's the sort of story one would hear at a cocktail party. Did you hear about the French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress who turned out to be A, a spy, and B, a man, and the diplomat claimed that he never knew the gender of his lover. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so I tried to learn more about the actual case, but this was in like 85. And so, of course, it was pre-internet, but also there just wasn't much access to even newspapers from France. And I didn't read French anyway. So there was like one column on page A26 of the New York Times. And when I found I wasn't able to figure out more of the actual case, I just sort of started making things up. And that ended up working out.
Was there a freedom to that? That ability to not necessarily feel like you have that responsibility that someone might feel now to kind of just take it in your own direction?
I think it was really. I think it was the best thing that could have happened. And then the interesting thing, and perhaps it says something about art, is that many of the things that I thought that I was making up turned out to be true. And we can get to that later or not.
Oh, very nice. And I was also going to ask what your relationship was with the opera Madame Butterfly, because obviously the play and the film are very critical of it and its kind of place. I'm just curious, was this something you came across and instantly had a reaction, or was it something that was built over time?
Yeah, I didn't have any particular specific beef with with Madame Butterfly that I was aware of. But it was sort of in the back of my consciousness as a kind of cultural stereotype of the submissive Asian woman, and probably the primary trope, which created this template about East-West relationships and romances that you see repeated over and over again through the 20th century, whether it's in works like Shogun or Miss Saigon, you have the kind of tragic Asian female heroine who suffers a lot and then ends up dying for the love of a white man. But again, it was just in the back of my mind. So I was thinking about this story of the French diplomat and the Chinese spy I kind of just kept coming back to it for about a year. And one day I asked myself, well, what did this diplomat think that he'd found? And the answer came to me, oh, he probably thought he'd found his version of Madame Butterfly. And at that point, I actually had never even heard the opera. And we had record stores in those days. I turned it into a record store. I bought it. And fortunately, the libretto ended up having everything that I thought it needed to have in order to use it as a sort of counterpoint and deconstruction for my play.
One thing, obviously, the reception to the play, as I mentioned, you win a Tony Award for Best Play, lauded and a beloved one now, a play you've even revived years later, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But what did it really do for your career as a playwright at that point when it came out and the great reception it got?
Yeah, I mean, it was a sort of huge seismic event in my career as a playwright. And it's probably still the defining event and still the play that most people know me for, if they know me at all. To have a hit on Broadway and a hit play and a play that was sort of not only commercially successful, but considered kind of serious and important, which ran on Broadway for 2 years, ran on the West End for a year, has been done in, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 dozen countries. And as we're going to talk about, became a movie. I mean, that just doesn't happen that often. And it was probably the case that for a very, brief period of time, I was the probably, the most successful American playwright. And Time magazine at the time wrote that, not since the heyday of Edward Albee. So yeah, it was a big event for my career, certainly.
I did have a question just about mounting that play, because the story is something of a critique of Western perceptions of Eastern culture. And you're creating this play that's going to be shown largely to Western audiences, and just about walking that line between being pretty, I think, sometimes harsh in your critique of the lead character, but making that work for basically the ticket buying audience.
Yeah, you never really know, but I don't know that I'm smart enough to say I figured out how to, exactly walk that line. I wrote the play that I wanted to write. And in fact, yes, the play was lauded and was a hit and everything, but there was also a lot of critical voices. I mean, if you happen to go back to 1988 and look at the reviews of M. Butterfly, first of all, it got panned out of town. We started in Washington, D.C. And one of the co-producers was David Geffen. Geffen had put up all the money, and Geffen wanted to close the show. He didn't want to bring us into New York, and so his co-producer Stuart Ostro, who was really the person on the ground, Stuart had to abrogate his production agreement with Geffen, mortgaged his house, and that's how he raised the money to get us to Broadway, where we opened with little to no advanced sales. And it's just one of those, dramatic Broadway stories that happens to have had a happy ending.
What was sort of the turning point then? Because if it didn't have the biggest opening off Broadway originally, what was that sort of? Was it a review or something that just clicked for everyone?
I mean, winning the Tony, I think, really sealed our fate. In those days, winning a Best Play Tony probably meant more commercially than it even does today. And Stuart also, I think, took a second mortgage on his house, and then made a TV commercial, which also at that point was relatively rare for a play.
Oh, that's interesting, because I remember growing up and seeing commercials for plays, and I would have been seeing those after M. Butterfly had become a success.
Probably. I mean, again, I don't. I'm sure you're probably the right age for that, but I don't know your exact age. But yes,
I'm 43.
And you don't have to say. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I don't mind. I'm not shy about it.
Well, you mentioned David Geffen, which I think is a name we might come back to in a minute. But Cam and I don't profess to be particularly experts on plays or musicals or Broadway or the West End, although I am right next to the West End, so I do get there quite often. But we are experts on spy movies. So let's shift the pattern on the talk onto M. Butterfly itself. At what point during the run of the play did the concept of a film begin?
Well, I actually think it started pretty early. I mean, once it became clear that the show is going to be a hit, the idea that the film rights would have been sold seemed pretty much like that would happen. And in fact, even before we went into production with the Broadway show, part of my contract was with Geffen was that he had last right of refusal on the film rights, which once the show was a hit, he then exercised.
I mean, pretty logical of him. I think
Yeah.
smell which way the wind's blowing. Why wouldn't you do
Yes.
that?
Yes.
So okay, so so it's interesting though that it comes up in sort of 1988. The conversation begins there because there is a 5-year gap between those two dates. Obviously, the release date in 1993. So what's happening in that period of time? What are the conversations at the beginning? Because you're down as I think at that stage as writing, obviously the adaptation.
Yeah.
David Cronenberg comes later on, which we'll get to that point. But for you, were you approached by David Geffen to do a screenplay for this? How did that conversation begin?
I feel like the screenplay didn't happen until uh, David Cronenberg came on board. So, in other words, there was the notion that Geffen would exercise his option on the property, on the IP, but then the package needed to be put together, which I think makes a certain amount of sense because for me to write the screenplay, I've already written the play, so we know what my take is on the material. And for me to write the screenplay without a director attached, probably would have meant that I would have to have gone back in and made substantial changes. So there were really a few years of trying to figure out, okay, who would the director be, and eventually I switched agencies. I went to a creative artist agency, and they represented both David and Jeremy Irons, and who had at that point just done Dead Ringers. And I think we're looking for something else to do together. And so that's kind of how this group came together.
Had you talked to any other directors before that happened?
Just informally. I mean, there was never anything. I'm trying to think, what can I say?
That's always the question.
It's been 30 years. You can say whatever you like. I won't tell anyone. It's okay.
Yeah, right. I mean, I did have some conversations with Neil Jordan.
Oh, right. Okay. It's interesting.
And you can read into that whatever you want or not.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting thing as well, because one thing we like to try and do with these interviews, especially with screenwriters and directors, is set the record straight a lot of the time. Because the Wikipedia page, for instance, reads slightly different to what we've already said in terms of events. I've seen other directors' names attached to this. I think Cam has a couple of names that were potentially around this project that haven't come up in this discussion. And also, Wikipedia alludes to the fact that there was a script before David Cronenberg even came along, so that seems like that wasn't the case. So I'm glad we're clearing that up. In your mind, because obviously there was a period of time where the package was being put together, did you visualize any directors you think would be good at handling the material? Obviously, we had David Cronenberg, but was there some people you thought might have been a good fit as well?
Yeah, I had. I was interested in Milos Forman because. To some extent, the structure of M. Butterfly is modeled on some of the Peter Shaffer plays. So that the Peter Shaffer plays being Equus and Amadeus. And Amadeus was, of course, made into a movie by Milos Forman. So he sort of seemed like a good fit to me. And what were there other directors that are mentioned on the internet?
I can say that the other two that are named are Warren Beatty and Roman Polanski.
I mean, I did have one conversation with Warren Beatty. I don't know that it ever went further than that.
Right.
And then there was the idea for a while that Roman Polanski would direct M. Butterfly on stage in Paris. And then maybe have something to do with the movie. But neither of those things ever happened. So it's not untrue that those names came up, but I don't think I've ever spoken to Roman Polanski.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Okay. The record is set straight there.
There we go. Which kind of changes my next question, but it's sort of in a good way because it allows you to write this whole new chapter of the story of M. Butterfly in a sense. Because from what we learned in the past or had been told, you'd written something before David Cronenberg showed up. But as you said, it seemed more like a process after he'd arrived. So what were you sort of asked to do by David Geffen and company? Did you write the screenplay alone at first, or was it a collaborative effort with David Cronenberg?
I think I did write the screenplay alone at first, and that's why there might be some confusion. And maybe I'm wrong because it's been a while now. But there was a draft that I gave to David that David gave me notes on. And I believe that was written when that first draft was written when he was already on board, but I wrote it by myself. But I guess it's possible that it was written before David came on board. I'm not sure. I still think my version is right, though.
I'd take your word for it over Wikipedia any day.
Well, that said, essentially I wrote a really epic version of a play that's pretty epic. So, you saw bombs falling over Vietnam and stuff like that. And I just remember David's note being, this is a great draft, but it's crazy. It would cost $300 million or something like that. And so that was when we started to kind of make it into a more practical, shootable script.
Was it a difficult transition for you just going from writing plays to writing for film?
Well, I'd done some work for film before. Like a lot of playwrights, well, then and now, we often make our livings in film and then film, nowadays more television. So it's not like I'd never written screenplays before. This was the first time I'd ever adapted one of my own pieces into a film. So in that respect, it was different. But I think I probably, when I think about planes and bombs falling on Vietnam, I think that, I must have been kind of influenced by Apocalypse Now, and other sort of big, expensive war epics.
Well, that was something I was going to ask you about, is that when you watch the movie, it's very cinematic.
Mm-hmm.
It does not feel stage-bound, and I have watched a lot of play adaptations over the many decades of film, and a lot of them feel like you've just watched something that's a little creaky. It's just the play, basically shown on your TV, and it doesn't have the same effect. And I was just curious, when you're going into the writing process, if that's something that's very cognizant in your mind, is to try to make this feel cinematic.
Yes, I think I remember asking myself, okay, the play uses a lot of theatrical devices. So what are the cinematic equivalents of that? For instance, one of the big dramatic moments in the play is when Sung, the Chinese spy, who we've watched as a woman for 2 acts, changes into a man on stage. And in a way, I think that's more common now. But back in '88, that was like, people were astounded. So what is the cinematic equivalent of that? And it seemed to me that, well, a lot of times the relationship between the story and the audience, what's going on stage and what's going on in the spectators' minds, is very direct when you're in the theater. That is, when you're watching a play, you look wherever you want. The director can try to focus you in a particular way, but the director is not literally controlling your gaze. Whereas in a movie, the director, of course, does. And that, therefore, a lot of the emotional impact, it seems to me, in movies, comes from not only my reaction as the audience member to what I'm seeing, but the reaction of other characters on the screen. So therefore, the notion that rather than directly as an audience member, I'm watching Sung transform, that would be something that would be more powerful if witnessed from another character. And that sort of gets translated in the kind of prison sequence at the end that leads to suicide. Of course, what happens in the paddy wagon. And it's those sorts of questions, like what is the cinematic equivalent to the effects and techniques that worked on stage?
Well, that actually leads me on to one of my other questions about the process of adapting your own work, because this was sort of, I would guess, about 4 years post, maybe 5 years post writing the original play itself. And did you take this opportunity to fine-tune certain things that you wanted to change in terms of messaging or structure? I mean, there are some changes that I'm aware of. You mentioned the one, obviously, changing the prison cell meeting to in the police van because just of how you'd shoot it, and they wouldn't have allowed them in reality into the prison cell.
Yeah.
Whereas the police van makes more sense. Like that, were there changes that you made or things you wanted to sort of fine-tune after the original version of the story?
That is a little hard for me to remember, to be honest. I mean, I do think that
That's fair.
one of the differences in focus, and David, I don't know if you're talking to David as part of the podcast, but David said pretty explicitly when the movie was released, so I don't even feel like this is telling a tale out of school, that David wanted to make a movie about how all romantic love is self-delusion. And so there is, I think, an emphasis on the kind of personal aspects of it, of the story, and the intimacy of the relationship between Gallimard and Sung, and less sort of Brechtian political didacticism that exists in the play.
Okay, and actually, you know what? While we're talking about it, I was very interested to know about working with David Cronenberg, because you have just created M. Butterfly. It's become a sensation, and now you're working with a director who's going to have his own ideas. And I was just interested to know about what some of those ideas were and how that sort of evolved the story.
I mean, I think that what I just sort of described as the difference in focus is the primary shift. And it is exactly, right, that the director, when we do this translation or any translation from stage to film, we are going from a medium in which the playwright is the primary artistic voice to one in which the director is the primary artistic voice. So in order to make the best movie that David can, he needs to have his sense of what he wants to focus on. And I, as a screenwriter, need to understand and work with that and try to support that, because otherwise it's just not going to be a good movie.
Totally. And were you a fan of David Cronenberg before you worked with him? Like, was he someone you were very familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like I'd seen most of his movies, sort of from the early kind of shocking, body horror movies, up through Dead Ringers at that point. And then as we were working on the movie, he was in post for Naked Lunch. So I got to see quite a few bits and pieces of that. But like a lot of screenwriters, I wasn't really around much for the shooting itself. I think I went to the set for like 2 days. It was just kind of a nice visit. And yeah, once we got a script that David was happy with, then, it became his thing. One of the things that he changed in the edit, which I think makes a certain amount of sense, is there in the play, we see there's a little more made of the diplomat's wife.
Right.
And we also see when they break up. And David just decided to move the story along. And I think now when Sung comes back to Paris, Gallimard just tells her that he's, he lives alone now. So that was sort of one important switch. And then not too many people not too many Western filmmakers had shot in China at that point. And so they learned so much actually being there that shifted things, of course, as it would in any movie.
Well, one thing about the sort of collaborative relationship with David Cronenberg I wanted to dig into is you mentioned about obviously working together, making the script, and then you sort of you weren't as much involved after that point, which does seem to be a sort of through line for many screenwriters we've spoken to over the years. But one step in between those two things, between shooting and script writing, is casting.
Mm-hmm.
And you are a producer on the film as well. So I was curious if you had any sort of insight into that process as well. You mentioned Jeremy Irons maybe potentially as part of the package that came with it. But there's a whole other cast of characters here, namely, I think most importantly, John Lone as Song Ling, one of the most vital characters of the film. I think a role that really needs to be cast well because it's a very specific role.
Yeah.
How involved were you in the sort of casting side of things?
On that level, it's not generally like you have auditions. So it's really just the conversations about who should we go out to. I know B.D. Wong, who did the role on Broadway and to much acclaim and many awards. B.D. was considered. David, for whatever reason, wasn't as inclined to make the movie with B.D. And John Lone and I had quite a long history. We started out together. My very first play, when I talk about the play that I wrote for my dormitory that got done at the Public Theater off Broadway in New York, that play starred John Lone, and that's where we first met. We did that play together. I wrote a second play for John called The Dance in the Railroad, which became the next play that the producer Joseph Papp produced of mine at the Public Theater. And then we'd also done a third play at the Public Theater. So John and I really emerged together. He then got his first major film role in Fred Skepsi's film Iceman. He became much better known through movie Year with the Dragon, Michael Cimino's movie, where he started to become, sort of a heartthrob. And by that point, by the time we were doing the M. Butterfly movie, had played the title role in Bertolucci's The Last Emperor. Mm-hmm. So John had both the kind of screen cred and star quality, and he and I had a history together. So it was David's decision, but I was actually quite happy that if it wasn't going to be BD, that it would be John.
Was there ever any consideration of bringing over John Lithgow? Or was once the package just happened with Jeremy Irons, that wasn't even a consideration?
I think it was because the fact that David and Jeremy wanted to work together again was the thing that kind of motivated them to come together on M. Butterfly. So unless for some reason Jeremy would have dropped out, I don't think anybody else was considered.
Right.
It's also kind of a small world that you mentioned, Fred Skepsi, someone who we've had on the show before, talking about his film The Russia House, because he was one of the first to shoot in Russia when they sort of opened up the barriers there to let you do that. And then, of course, M. Butterfly, one of the first to shoot in China there. So Western productions anyway. And I just thought that was a nice bit of symmetry there. But moving on to then sort of the production side of things, you took a little bit of a step back, but you did visit the set a couple of times. I was just curious as sort of what part of the set you got to visit, and did you see it being shot? And any sort of memories of being on the set and seeing your play that you've seen on a stage be blown up onto a screen that's just a much bigger thing? That's a whole different experience, I imagine.
Well, except that I'm not really watching it on the screen. And in those days, it's not like I mean, I've since worked on other TV shows and movies and things. Of course, now we have instant playback, and everybody goes to Video Village, and you see but that wasn't the case in those days. That was literally still shooting on film, and you don't know what the film's going to look like. And so basically, I was watching. Think I feel like I watched a scene with John and Jeremy that it's that kind of long pan which starts on one there. It's basically a lovemaking scene, but it starts on one side of the room, moves really slowly, and then eventually you see them kind of at the end of the pan, kind of making out together. And there's, it's a sort of scene that takes a long time to shoot and is very specific. And there's maybe not that much to see if you're just a bystander. So I also became aware of how movies are made, but it wasn't, I would say, quite as dramatic as getting to see what things look like when it's put together, or even the dailies.
Yeah, I guess it's not a moment that you walk away going, "Well, this thing is off and running."
Yeah. I did get somebody. They had sent me a VHS of the title sequence at some point, which I thought was really great.
Oh, yeah.
I loved the title sequence and I was just thrilled. I mean, that, if anything, was a moment where I was like, wow, this is a real movie. There's a title sequence. It's very cool. There's credits.
And I think those were the first ever CG credits, I think, too.
Really?
They might have been. I believe that was in the research. Yeah.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware. It's one of the first digitally created credit sequences with the moving backgrounds and stuff.
Yeah.
There you go.
I don't know. But anyway, I thought it was really cool.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Red Alert Spyhards, we are shaking things up over on the Patreon page.
That's right, we are launching an exclusive new show where we tackle the exploits of the small screen's greatest secret agents, like Jack Bauer, George Smiley, and beyond.
And don't forget, every month you also get 2 Agents in the Field episodes where we decode the adventures of your favorite spy actors in their biggest non-spy movies. But Cam, tell the people what we have coming up next.
Folks, bid October and the spooky season adieu by catching up with our latest Patreon offerings. That's right, reviews of The Exorcist and Shaun of the Dead, plus the 2017 Taken TV pilot. A Taken TV show without Liam Neeson? Now that is scary.
So strap on your Condor Man wings and soar into the future with us over at patreon.com/spyhards.
But before Big O zaps us with a red pulsating laser, let's get back to the Spy Jinx.
Well, okay, so then at that point you popped in, you've seen a bit being shot, and then we go through the editing process, and then the film is made. And I noted, and I think I'm stealing Cam's question here, but John Lone has mentioned in interviews since that there was about 20 minutes cut out of the film that he thinks were quite vital to, I think, more his character and performance in the film. I know obviously you weren't there for the whole shoot, but do you recall anything in that editing process, or perhaps what those 20 minutes were? Because there's no sort of idea as to what those lost 20 minutes were.
I don't. Because I wasn't. I didn't see early cuts, so I don't know what existed that other than the loss of the breakup of the wife. I don't know what scenes were lost. I mean, there may have been scenes. I'm trying to remember the movie. Are there scenes with Sung Lee Ling and Comrade Chin in the movie?
Yes.
There's a couple of quick meetings with them. I think it was one in a stairwell, I seem to recall.
Yeah.
One at Song's house.
There was considerably more scenes between Comrade Chin and Sung Lee Ling in the play. So, and I believe those were in the screenplay. So that could very well have been what John is referring to.
Yeah, I had read that there was a intention to kind of shift the film version more towards the relationship and a little less towards the politics. And is that perhaps something that was shaped there in the edit?
Yeah, I think that that is a fair way to characterize the difference between the film and the play, and is consistent with this notion that David was interested in a movie about how romance is self-delusion. So therefore, if we're going to speculate, it's a logical speculation that the kind of more political material between Sung and Chin would have been cut, and that John might also see that as being giving more insight into his character.
Yep, that makes sense. And I was going to ask you about bringing the character of Sung to the screen, because there's so much subtlety that we can read into that performance, and in many ways that's the emotional core, I think, for the audience that they are brought into. And just the differences, because obviously the camera can pull so much more out of the character when you're that close versus the stage version. And when you're, whether that's writing it as well as just yourself seeing the film version versus the play.
Yeah, I think so. If we think about the fact that the play is essentially told from Gallimar's point of view, Gallimar narrates the play rather like in Amadeus, the way that Salieri is the main figure and has more of a voiceover. In Butterfly, Gallimar does not have a voiceover. So we are not, he is not defining the lens of the play, of the movie, in the way that he does in the play. Now, in the play, then there's a battle for the narrative, and then Sung ends up having the narrative starting in the courtroom. But the film is necessarily more objective, as it were. I mean, the camera has the camera's point of view instead of Gallimar's point of view. And therefore, Sung emerges on her own terms, and we meet her on her own terms, or at least the camera's terms, instead of through Gallimar's eyes. And I think that does, therefore, mean that Sung is more three-dimensional from the start, as opposed to being more of a cultural stereotype at the beginning, even though Sung talks back to Gallimar even at their first meeting. But essentially, we're seeing Sung through a kind of Madame Butterfly lens in the play, and that's not the case in the movie. So that makes a lot of sense to me as an analysis, and also tells us a lot about why the intimacy of the relationship becomes more central in the movie, and the politics, the Brechtian, whatever we want to call it, is much less emphasized.
And there's so much ambiguity too, whether it's the relationship, whether it's the way they perceive each other, because Sung is a spy as well as someone who may be in love. We don't know. Like, it's for us to read into. And that is something that, revisiting the movie, is incredibly rich. And I was rewatching it last night. It's so rewarding to go back to. At the same time, that's a challenge to a lot of audiences. Was that something that was a concern when you were making the movie?
Well, because in some sense, the point of view of the play is more schematic. And I think it's clearer in the play that Sung is kind of doing a job and has a certain amount of even contempt for Gallimar. Where in the movie, I do think it's more ambiguous, and we don't know what, as you say, what she's actually feeling. We know she's a spy, but we don't know if there is actual love here. And there is more of a possibility, I think, in the movie that there is real love. And I think that is a more nuanced point of view, and also therefore more challenging, as you suggest, because it doesn't set out the kind of emotional parameters as clearly as the play does. But arguably, particularly now as our notions of gender have evolved, arguably makes the relationship feel a little more contemporary in its ambiguity.
It's actually a really good point, and sort of a question I had, or at least a note, is one thing Cam and I reflected upon when we reviewed this a while ago, is it actually feels like a story that should have been told then, but it also feels quite relevant now in a lot of sort of the trans rights and things that people are really pushing forward now. And this film, I think, and I've read online, is being found by a whole new audience. And I'm glad that it's being discovered and reappraised in that way. And just sort of your thoughts on that, and it being now found by this whole other community that are really championing it.
Yeah, it's been, very satisfying. It's to feel that I created something in the play and that we created something in this movie that is complex enough that it can be discovered by future generations who are able to relate to aspects even that are different than the original audience may have gravitated towards. That's, incredibly satisfying. And the fact that it has, we did it again on Broadway. It's become an opera. It's actually being done at the Barbican this Friday night. And is it's just nice to create something that's able to have a long life. I feel like if this might be an opportunity to, as you say, set the record straight, and that I can tell a story that I've never told before.
Okay.
About the search for directors. So now, we go back to like 89 or 90, right after the play, when the play's still running on Broadway. It's running in London. David Geffen has optioned the film rights. And I was interested in Milos Forman, but I was also interested in Neil Jordan. So Eiko Ishioka, who designed M. Butterfly on Broadway, and who subsequently went on to, she won an Oscar for Dracula. She became a very prominent costume designer for film as well. So Eiko knew Neil Jordan and arranged a lunch. We had a lunch in London and got along really well. And I really liked him, and I think he liked me. And we got to the point where we were both talking about, okay, so what are you working on now? And I told him about a movie that I was working on. And he told me this story that he was working on about an IRA that was set in the world of the IRA. But at that point, it didn't have a gender switch in it. And so I then suggested Neil Jordan to David Geffen, and David, for whatever reason, wasn't interested in Neil at the time, which is sort of interesting because Neil Jordan ended up directing a lot of things for David Geffen. So Neil didn't end up directing M. Butterfly. And at some point, while we were in post with M. Butterfly, we start to hear about this movie called The Crying Game.
Yep.
And The Crying Game gets released before M. Butterfly. And so a few years later, I asked Eiko, have you ever seen Neil Jordan? Could you just ask, did this have anything to do with the fact that The Crying Game, when it came out, did have a gender switch and reveal in it. Did this have anything to do with his not getting M Butterfly? And Aiko eventually said to me, well, I asked Neil and he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no.
Very ambiguous.
So, and if that was the case, then fine. I mean, you can't. People have been doing gender switch stories since the Greeks and the ancient China and all that. So it's not anything you can copyright, but it's always been an interesting question in the back of my mind.
It was a question I had about sort of the reception to this, and I think you've already answered it there, and a little bit of history there has been filled in and on both films, I think, by the sounds of it. And I think the last question I've got about M Butterfly before I slowly wrap us up and talk about a couple of other quick things is just postscript, looking back on the film version of, as you said earlier, perhaps the biggest play you've written in your career so far. Seeing that on the big screen, seeing that adaptation, what are your thoughts on the film looking back on it now?
I feel like I was thrilled when I saw the film, and I remember going up to David Geffen and saying, "Oh, thank you for making the film," because we'd had some conflicts about the play, and I thought David made a beautiful picture. It's different than mine, which it should be. It's mine is, as we talked about earlier, has more of an emphasis on the political. But I do think that David's vision for the story has helped to make it even more timeless as the years have gone by, and this focus on the relationship itself and the intimate aspects of the dynamic between Sung and Gallimar is part of what helps it to speak to new audiences today that are much more conscious of gender fluidity and the fact that a gender is a spectrum, not a binary. So if anything, I've probably grown to like the film more in the intervening years.
And I want to ask about the changes you made to the play version. But before I do that, before we leave the movie behind, this is a spy movie podcast, I just want to ask, a lot of the spycraft in this movie, I love how basically mundane it is. If you had any influences that were inspiring the writing of the spy elements.
I would say number one, I maybe am not particularly good at writing a spy movie that has more intricate plotting. So that was part of it. But also, the real case, what I knew of it even when I wrote the original play, and what we started to learn a lot about the real spies, Borsico and Shipe-Pu, once the play was a hit, because everybody started interviewing them. And Borsico, actually, I then gave a percentage of the play to each of them. And Borsico then, really, he's still alive, but over the intervening decades, has followed the play around to different cities where it premieres, and he shows up and he goes, "I'm the real guy," and they take him out for drinks. But the Borsico spying was also incredibly banal. There was not anything that was of major security significance that anyone's been able to discover that he passed along as a result of this whole series of machinations.
Well, it had some like Le Carre energy, and I did appreciate it because it was just fun to kind of hang out in that world for a little bit.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, you made changes to the play version. I would just like to know kind of what those significant changes were.
I mean, if anything, the changes probably were closer in tone to what David did in the movie, in terms of making the play less about a gender binary and more about gender fluidity, and acknowledging the real feelings and love, and how all romantic relationships to some extent exist in their own hermetically sealed world. I think that the play moves more in that direction, and it happens to dovetail with David's vision more consistently.
Now, I'm conscious of your time, and I've got two big questions I can't let you go without asking. And that is, firstly, as I mentioned at the top, you've got a play out on Broadway at the moment. It's the New York Times critic pick. Got rave reviews, Yellowface. What can you tell us about it? And I know it's got its run is coming to a close, I think, later this year, from what I've been told.
The limited run.
Yeah. So what can you tell us about it, and where can people find out more about it?
Oh, thank you. It's a comedy about a playwright named DHH who protests the casting of the Welsh actor Jonathan Pryce as the Eurasian lead in the original production of the musical Miss Saigon when it first comes to Broadway. And then David accidentally cast a white actor as the Asian lead in his own follow-up to M. Butterfly. And when he finds out that he's done this, tries to cover up his mistake to protect his reputation as a political activist and Asian American role model.
There is a lot to unpack in that, and I love every single thing about it already.
I mean, it's the character is called DHH, and so I did participate in that protest. And then there's also an incident at the end of the play, which is also quite well documented in newspapers. So it's sort of a stage mockumentary.
Well, we will put links in the show notes below for people to go click on that and find out more about the play. They can go to the website, get some tickets.
Thank you. And we run until November 24th on Broadway, with starring Daniel Day Kim.
There you go. Oh, Daniel Day Kim is fantastic. So there you go. And there'll be about a month before this coming out and ending. So go and get your tickets, folks, because if it's anything like M. Butterfly, we love that. It's getting our seal of approval. I have two final questions. One, behind you is the M. Butterfly Tony sat on that wonderful shelf.
Oh yeah, it is. Yes. So yes, once the pandemic started, my Zoom camera got set up in front of my ego wall.
I wish I had one. I unfortunately it's just film posters, which I didn't make, so I have nothing to offer the world. And my last question, this has been asked to everyone we've ever had on the show, coming up to 100 interviews now. We talk about spy movies here every week. David, I'm very curious. What is your favorite spy movie of all time?
Oh, probably The Third Man.
Oh, very nice. Which just had an anniversary as well, so that's very timely.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, 80th anniversary.
Wow.
That's a fantastic movie, and we just revisited it ourselves. Right. You really can't go wrong with that one.
You really can't. David, it's been absolutely wonderful to go back into the world of M. Butterfly with you, to set the record straight on a few things as well, and uncover some new bits of this story. I'm glad we had this opportunity to speak to you.
Well, thanks for having me on.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, David. There you go, folks. That was our chat about M. Butterfly with David Henry Hwang. David, I hope you're listening, and I want to thank you once again for taking the time to speak with us. We have set many records straight. I hope that Wikipedia page gets changed.
And this was an absolute pleasure, and it's rare we get the chance to talk to someone who adapted their own work into a spy film. And so there was so much depth. I mean, this could have been like a 3-hour chat, just going through the minutia of M. Butterfly, moment to moment. But, I think we covered as much as we were able to. And there was just so much great insight just in terms of the differences between the play and the film, and just the process of creating the film, and how it was its own unique entity and stands alone in that regard.
Absolutely. Now, we'll just jump in before I sort of talk about the interview any further. If this is your first time checking out an interview here on Spy Hard, we have close to 100 interviews with different filmmakers and actors over the last close to 5 years now. So make sure you hit the subscribe button and check out some of those interviews in our back catalogue. There's a lot to jump into. But talking of M. Butterfly, I mean, it's such a powerful film. And, we've been trying to get this interview for a while now, and I'm so glad we got the opportunity to really take this film apart with him. I know we only had about an hour to talk to David, but I feel like we really got to the heart of M. Butterfly, I think, in that discussion. And I don't think there's a better person to really talk to about that film than the man who came up with it.
Yeah, and I would love to see this on the stage. Vancouver is not the world's greatest place if you want to see, plays. There are some, but it may be a while before M. Butterfly rolls into this town. But it's like the film really just, I thought, was so intriguing, and I loved diving into the ambiguity of it. And I'm really intrigued to see the play, because I think just hearing about the difference in the versions, and also the fact that they were confident in the story they were telling and willing to kind of pull it away from the play, make it its own thing. And so that there is an actual difference versus examples, and there are so many from the history of Hollywood of you can see the film and you can go and see the play, but like the film version feels like they just filmed the play and made it look a little gussier, but it's not exactly something that feels cinematic and vibrant, whereas M. Butterfly does, and the performances are so subtle and nuanced in a way that just wouldn't work on the stage.
And, conversely, there's many examples of this, not only from plays, but from books, I think, for spy movies, certainly from books or from real events, that just get so sort of morphed by the time you get it to the feature film side of things that it almost looks nothing like the original text or the original bit of history. And I think David Cronenberg did a very good job, and with David putting the screenplay together, of finding a middle ground between making changes, but making changes that serve the film.
Yeah, no, 100%. And one of the things I thought was really encouraging about talking to David about this movie was hearing the story, first of all, about meeting with Neil Jordan to work on this film. But obviously the Crying Game was a big sensation, and this movie didn't perform particularly well at the box office and has more so gained legs over time. But in 1992 and 3, the idea of these two movies coming out close to each other felt like, well, only one can succeed. In the same way that years later, you'd have two volcano movies or something, or two comet movies, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it is encouraging, as much as we feel like progress moves very, 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 very slowly, that I think nowadays, if these two movies came out within half a year of each other, it would not be regarded as, well, we can't watch one because we watched the other. It would feel like they both have a place in the marketplace and would be accepted on their own terms.
And I think just getting that little nugget of information about the Crying Game and how the original version of that script didn't look as similar to M. Butterfly as it did eventually. Necessarily 100% confirmed. I think that's about as close as you're going to get to a confirmation of that being the case. And again, it's one of those things that, we talk about it when we do these sort of post-script chats after our interview sometimes, that we get these little bit of nuggets that can almost recontextualize the view of a film, post its release. Mm-hmm. And I'm amazed that we can get these bits of information from time to time, and we find these nuggets, and people are generous enough to share these stories with us. It always baffles me. But this is why I love doing these interviews. And okay, this isn't an interview about GoldenEye, so I can understand why the odd person who's a spy movie fan might not necessarily run to M. Butterfly. But this is the power of having these interviews and talking to these people who worked on films that aren't necessarily the mainstream film. Because the thing is, Martin Campbell has been spoken to 1 billion times about Bond films. I don't know how many times David Henry Hwang has been spoken to about the screenplay for M. Butterfly. Maybe the play, but certainly not the screenplay. And if we're one of the first to do that, this is the sort of good stuff you get from that.
Well, exactly. And these are the interviews I'm always the most excited to do, and the ones that have the most satisfaction, because you feel like you're contributing to the larger discussion of the movie. And, David was so eloquent in just discussing the whole process and the themes and the ideas of the film. And so it becomes this invaluable companion to watching the movie.
Yeah, and some of our interviews have been referenced in other media. We've had citations in books, citations in YouTube essays and stuff. Recently, Calvin Dyson, bless him, he's been on the show a bunch of times. We love Calvin here on Spy Hards, but he featured our Jeff Kleeman and Denise Richards interviews, two of our most popular interviews, and I think two of our best interviews on a recent discussion talking about Dr. Christmas Jones and sort of reevaluating her in The World Is Not Enough. And I don't mean to connect that with M. Butterfly or anything, but it's just sort of talking about the power of these interviews and what they can really offer. And I'm so glad we get to do them. I'm so glad we got to talk about M Butterfly once again, because I'd hate for that to be the last time a couple of years ago we spoke about the film, because I think it's such an important bit of spy media, and that's why it made the knock list.
And hopefully we have some opportunity in the future to cover it in some fashion again.
David Cronenberg, we're coming for you.
That's right.
But on that button there, Cam, the question goes to you. What are we talking about next week?
Well, Scott, definitely a change of pace, that's for sure. We are going to look at the 2020 family spy comedy, My Spy, starring Dave Bautista.
It might be a bit of a tonal clash from Possession and M Butterfly, but that's what we do best here at Spy Hards. We keep you guessing, like all agents should. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, folks, is to join us next week as we team up with Dave Bautista to take a look at My Spy. Now, if you like what you heard on the show, and you probably heard the ad in the middle, please consider joining us over on our Patreon, patreon.com/spyhards. We try our best not to plug it too much during the episode, but any and every bit of support you guys can do for us is genuinely appreciated. It all just goes to keeping the lights on here at SpyHards. Cam and I don't take the money ourselves. It just goes into buying the website, buying the software that helps us edit the show and things like that. So we genuinely appreciate anything and everything you all can do. We know times are hard, so this show will always be free. Don't worry about that. But if you can support us, we would love it if you could. There are links in the show notes below. I do also want to make sure I mention before we close out, if you are in New York or you're close by, do consider checking out Yellowface. There'll be links in the show notes below. Help support friend of the show, David Henry Hwang. It sounds like a great time. The New York critics clearly love it, and I think you might just love it too. And to wrap us up finally, make sure you follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards. Wherever you get your social medias, we're probably there. But until next time, folks, you'll find Cam and I furiously typing an email to David Cronenberg's agent.